Hi, all. It's Alyssa, and I cannot stop thinking about the film Weapons from Zach Cregger. And I just wanted to make a video where I was talking about three of the points that I really extracted from this movie. But what I think is so cool about the movie is there's so many pieces and so many things that you can see. And I've seen it twice, and I just feel like there are certain things I hear about the movie that I keep hearing about time and time again, but there are certain things I haven't really heard people say that I thought of the first time that I saw it. So I thought, let me share my ideas. So obviously, this is going to be just chock full of spoilers. So if you have not seen the movie, please do not watch this because there are just so many surprises and unexpected items that happen in this film that you would not want anything spoiled for you. I'm not really going to explain what was going on in the movie because I thought that it was very apparent, and Zach Cregger did a great job of showing everything and showing everything with Aunt Gladys and not telling what she was doing as a witch. But I really want to focus on 3 points. One being addiction, which is something that I think you can really see in a first viewing of the movie. The second is how that sort of addiction can lead people to be manipulated, and how Aunt Gladys is really connected also to addiction and the ruling class, and how all of that kind of comes together by getting everyone's different perspective in the way the story is told, and how all those different perspectives contribute to this sort of communal trauma that people have gone through within this community. Now, I first started this because before I saw the movie, I thought I had the movie spoiled in a sense because I had read some article. I don't know if it was Vanity Fair or something like that, but it was with Alden Ehrenreich. And one of the main metaphors that they said in the title of the article. So, like, I wasn't even reading the article. I didn't click on the article. I didn't anything. It just popped up. And it said how weapons is just one giant metaphor for a school shooting and gun violence. And while there is definitely evidence of that in the story, that wasn't the major thing that I took away from the story. To me, what I kept seeing again and again was this motif of sharp objects and how those sharp objects are puncturing people, making people weak, making people snap. And so we see it in very literal ways. So we see it with like the hypodermic needle with James, and how James uses that because of his own drug addiction, but also how he uses that as a defense weapon when he's going against Paul, the cop. We see the fork that keeps going through the parent's face over and over again, and they don't have any control of it because Aunt Gladys is making them do that. And then you actually have that sort of like prickly plant that Aunt Gladys uses, and to get what she wants and to weaponize people, she has to prick herself. So there's always that feeling and that tension of drug addiction. You see a lot with alcoholism because you have Garner's character Justine, who it's almost like she's an alcoholic who won't admit she's an alcoholic. Paul is an alcoholic, the police officer who does admit that he's an alcoholic. Then you have someone like Archer, who, to me, his addiction in the story was so much about like work and maintaining this air of masculinity and having control, because Archer's character, played by Josh Brolin, was really interesting because his child Matthew was the bully, with someone who seems like their parent is not really paying that much attention to them, because bullies are usually acting out because they don't have that sort of support at home. And I got the impression that Archer wasn't really around for his son that much, and that he was working all the time. And we know he's working all the time because his construction company essentially built the entire neighborhood that they're living in. So it didn't seem like he was around that much. He's very focused on work, but then he becomes focused on the control of sort of finding the children, finding the 17 kids who went missing. And he sort of takes that energy of addiction and he shifts it to something else, which does help because he solves the entire, he's a big part of solving the mystery. but he never really was there for his son. And he uses this sort of masculinity to pump himself up to be the guy who's screaming at the teacher, who's going after people and wants answers and becomes very aggressive and doesn't really look at the full situation and what is going on. And so I saw all of this with the addiction in the story. And then I started doing a little bit of research. I was just reading articles, I was watching YouTube videos with Zach Cregger, and I was just like, oh, wow, of course. He had two instances with addiction. So, one, he had lost someone who's very close to him quite recently. And he said he used the story as a way of coping with that loss and with that grief. And that leads me to another thing I loved about the movie. While I did find the movie was so much about loss and grief, addiction, it wasn't 100% on the surface. So the movie was just a lot of fun. So I feel like he wanted to make a story that was scary, fun, funny, had you going in a million different directions, and it didn't feel like a depressing horror movie, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this sort of fairy tale-esque story was just so depressing, especially when you think about the ending of the film and even the beginning, how it starts off with that little girl telling the story and like how many generations removed are we? Is this a couple of years? Is this like a generation later? And it's a sort of like a tale that's being told of what happened and everything that happened within this community. I thought it was really interesting how it is set as that fairy tale to encapsulate something that's very real about addiction. Because the other part of the story is, he said the last part with Alex was essentially an autobiography. And it was funny because when we were done watching the movie, me and my husband, I said to him, I felt like there was this whole other story about abuse within households and how it affects children, and how sometimes there are children who have to step up and do these very adult things because Alex has to, feed not only his parents, he has to feed all of the 17 children that are in the basement. He's taking care of them. He's trying to keep them like as clean as possible. He's trying to keep everything together and avoid the public, the outside, from asking questions. He wants everything to look as normal as possible because he's afraid of sort of exposing Aunt Gladys or exposing that addiction which is in the family. And I thought, wow, that is such a incredible way to be so personal and say so much about yourself, yet not make it be so obvious and not make it feel like a pity party, and but make it so that everyone would connect to this on some kind of level. And I love that element of what is going on here. And to me, this all leads into another section, which is really like, who is Aunt Gladys, played by Amy Madigan in the story? And I don't know. I left the theater one thinking, I thought she was like hundreds of years old and she was just like barely surviving, but that she had been through so much in her life. So it actually got me to thinking, and I don't think this was even part of what he meant in making the movie, but I honestly couldn't help but see how Aunt Gladys sort of felt like an old school, like a ruling class that doesn't have any real skills other than to manipulate people below her or below them to get what they want. So getting the masses or weaponizing the masses against each other. Okay, future Alyssa here. I completely forgot to say this, but one of the first things I realized about Aunt Gladys was that her name, Gladys, actually means ruler. So that was the whole thing that sort of sent me down the fact that I thought Aunt Gladys represented the ruling class because her name literally means ruler, and she is ruling over all of these subjects who she takes advantage of. Okay, back to the video so that they could get something for themselves. And so I could not help but see this when I was looking at like, okay, how Archer is always going after Justine in the beginning of the story. And well, she's the teacher. So obviously she's the one that caused all of this. And he never speaks to her directly, or he never speaks to her in a calm fashion. It's in these public forums, and he is screaming at her. And it could like, it was so real to life feeling, and it was these aspects that made me feel like this film Weapons actually had a lot in common with Eddington in terms of talking about how there is no like discourse between people, and people are just put into categories, and if you're not in the same kind of group, you are automatically weaponized against each other. And so I felt like Aunt Gladys represents this kind of addiction that people have, but also how addiction can lead to their own sort of like internal downfall, and how they're really just in so much pain. And you have the idea of like the needles that are poking, and this kind of intrusion, and there's a breaking point. And we literally see with Aunt Gladys and the like little stick thing that has people's hair or an object for them, once they break, like she causes them to break, and then they literally mentally break. So people who were very, very normal before were, Archer, he's not, I would not say he was normal or Justine was normal the whole time, but you would see people break in a way. And it's very much because of Aunt Gladys, who is sort of this, in my brain, an amalgam of what addiction is and how it can ruin internal family, but also how a ruling class can come in and just use people as pawns to sort of start fighting over here so that she could use the children over here and try to heal herself in some way. And so I felt like in some way, one, Aunt Gladys to me was not human. She was more of like an idea of something. But I also felt like she was a different entity that had lived for like hundreds and hundreds of years and was just sort of like floating through and using people when she needed to use people. And I'm not even entirely convinced that Aunt Gladys was actually related to this family, or if she sort of inserted herself. And it was always like the idea of an Aunt Gladys, because it's sort of like in everyone's family, there's someone who's called an aunt, but they may not be related, or they're very like distant related. They're like second cousins, third cousins, but they're still your aunt so and so, but you don't really know anything about them. They're not really around you. And I feel like she uses that, and she uses that niceness of family to sort of get what she wants. And what she wants is to keep surviving. She's ill. So if we go with this metaphor of, the sort of ruling class being in charge, well, it's almost like we're at the end of that era. And now there's the next group, because who kills her in the end? Well, ultimately, it's Alex, who uses her own sort of like magic against her. But it's almost like a new generation coming over, and they're literally tearing her limb from limb, and they're going to take over now. And that there's almost like a hope that things could be better, but yet in the very last shot, it feels very hopeless, while trying to, in a weird way, seem positive, like, oh, but we rescued the kids, and some of them even speak now, like, and how long did it take these kids to start speaking again? So it's once again like a very dark and twisted fairy tale. And to me, what works the most in the movie is how he puts it together with all of these different perspectives, which is something I didn't expect at all. It was very surprising. That was a very popular technique, to have, everyone's different perspective. I want to say in like the late 90s, the early 2000s, but I hadn't seen it for a while. And I felt like it really was used here with a great point, because it's so much about perspective and how people don't see each other. I loved the way the cinematography was done, because when it was like James, who's the drug addict, I felt like I was almost watching a Safdie brothers movie, and it was so quick and fast paced, and the way the camera was moving and where the camera was, like where the camera was angled for James. And it was always like, oh, it was a weird high angle shot or even like a Dutch angle shot. But then when we saw the same scene from Paul's point of view, so the police officer, things felt kind of out of control, but still like more grounded in a normal reality because he was seeing things through that perspective. I also love how in the movie, when you go to different shots, they're not set up exactly the same way from the way you've seen the scene before, because now you're seeing it from another person's perspective, and that person is always going to see things in a totally different way. And so I thought that whole idea of like lack of understanding perspective contributed to the whole idea of, the ruling class trying to weaponize people against each other and be angry at each other and use each other so that they can get something that they want, essentially. And so it worked well when we're looking at like Archer's point of view and Justine's point of view. So I just loved the narrative structure of how it contributes that whole idea from like addiction to like the ruling class to how we see things from an individual perspective. But then once characters sort of like collide and have to interact and see things for themselves, that's when they actually see each other for the first time. So the scene where the principal, Marcus, is running like crazy after Justine. And this whole time, Archer is just looking at Justine as the villain. But then when he sees what is happening to her in a very, very extreme way, and how the principal is being weaponized against her through Amy Madigan, through Aunt Gladys, then all of a sudden he does actually step up and he does the right thing and he helps her. And not only does he help her, he connects with her after, and they go and they look at the footage of the kids running in the same way that Marcus was running. So it's almost like through understanding different perspectives, but having to almost like physically be with that person and their perspective, that's when you have some sort of knowledge and awareness and reflection on what is going on. So like all of these things came together, and the thing I kept hearing or seeing on Letterboxd was like people saying, "Oh, that was really fun. It was really entertaining," but it was not about anything. And I was like, how, I don't know how you could say that. I felt like it was about so many things within our society. Those are the three things that I kind of loved the most about the movie. But I would love to get a discussion going and hear what all of you thought about sort of the deeper meaning of what was going on within Weapons. To me, when a movie just sticks with you, there's a reason and there's more going on underneath. And I always want to dig and sort of figure out this one. I wanted to make sure I saw it twice and I could pick up on like the little details here and there. But I really, really enjoyed it and would love to hear some of your theories on the film. So please leave it in the comments below. If you liked this video, you may want to hit the like button and subscribe if you haven't already. I really appreciate you watching and would love to hear all of your ideas. Bye all.